Come on, right before 7. It's quite a conversation going on. Math, algebra, trig. Good grief! Like, when did guys start? 6? Crazy. A couple nights ago, my wife and I are watching the Magnolia Network. You know, the Chip and Joanne Gaines network, right? They turned into from what was before just a smaller deal. Now it's a bigger operation. There's a show called Restoration Road with their former carpenter, Clint Hart. And it's fabulous. So we're watching it, and the story the other night was on them restoring a 1700s building up in New York in an apple orchard area and moving it to Waco, Texas, and becoming a apple cider mill. A great story. Well, yesterday morning, I woke up and thought, wow, apple cider sounds so good. Hey, I'm retired. I can do whatever I want. So I said to Earlene, I said, why don't we go to the orchard, and we could just do it. I don't have to be at campus. I don't have to be at chapel at 10. I don't have to be all these things. So, it was not. That's how it felt like retirement yesterday. Have that free schedule, right? Just to, like, nothing that prevents us going right now. Just let's go do that for a few hours. Now, because of course, after a month, she's already a little tired of me around too much. We did take 2 cars and went to 2 different orchards, but the point was, no, we had a good time. We went up to Highland Valley, and in fact, I'm still working on these fabulous apple cider donuts. I got eating too many first couple of days. Anyway, so the retirement, the schedule thing is great, right? That's just a wonderful part of the whole retirement thing. So loving that. So talking about all these teenagers, and boy, someone's commenting in the prayer. Again, I don't know. Like, I was watching the superintendent of Philly schools yesterday, right? And others are like, how do you respond? What do you do? When they say this is not acceptable, they're right. But it's like, how do you address that, right? Because these are so many problems that are so common throughout the culture and society. It's not just a few teenagers shooting somebody. I mean, there's just so many things. It's so hard. And of course, if you're parents or grandparents like ourselves, it's extra concerning, because we're always concerned about safety and things. So I don't know, it's overwhelming sometimes, isn't it? But I guess what we do is well, Sandy, you had it in your prayer a little bit of there about just understanding who's in charge. That's there's a creator who knows what's going on, and we don't understand what's going on, but we have to be faithful, and we have to rely on trusting what God might do with some of these things. But boy, it sure is challenging, and it's really tough to be, especially as I get older. I think I've got less to impact on trying to do something with teenagers. Although, I got to figure out, like, what's my role still going to be? I mean, is there still an impact I have with kids somehow? I think there's probably still is. I got to figure that out exactly, but it'll be different than what I've done in the past. So we were finishing last week a little bit about that question 3 on purpose. And we were talking about kids and involvement in ministry, and we were brainstorming a little bit, like what happens at Wayne, and some good typical things where kids are involved in some of the worship things and stuff. But what, it's often hard to do in bigger churches, because there's a standard of quality too that you have to be very careful about, right? Like, you don't have just anybody get up and sing or speak or whatever, because you got a lot of people attending worship. There's a lot of I don't want to say pressure. There's a high standard that things are going to be done well, right, and thoughtfully, and sometimes in a small church, not quite as critical, probably for the quality angle. But one of the things is, in a little small church, you can have kids do things that maybe be hard to do in a larger church. But still, a large church has to figure out, how do we involve kids in this community, as opposed to just kind of once in a while allowing them to do something or giving them lip service. How do we actually honor them as parts of the community? And sometimes what happens is that we forget in actual worship, having kids do Youth Sunday or sing once in a while or something is great, but it doesn't really reflect where kids are at in terms of every week of their lives. Does Wayne, if there's a way to do this at all, I don't know. Can Wayne honor kids in worship where it reflects their culture and their issues a little bit. So that sometimes is sermon issues, right? Like whoever's preaching to try and reflect on not just what adults are interested in or read or watch in terms of illustrations, but things that our kids are into, right? Like you got to reflect on those things. But are there places where teenagers get a chance to participate beyond music in the worship service? Those are hard things to do, but they're kind of important. Now, we've been referencing, of course, the book from Fuller Youth Institute. Their previous work, as I mentioned a few weeks ago, which became known as the Sticky Faith series. They got a whole bunch of books on sticky faith because they've been studying what helps students have faith that lasts into college from their churches in high school and middle school. And their sticky faith research, 15 years of research, they have some very interesting conclusions they had in a previous some work. Now, listen to a couple of these things that when they said, like, here's their findings after well over a decade of research. And they have a bunch of things, but here's a couple key ones I thought were kind of fascinating. One of their main things they discovered: involvement in all church worship during high school is more consistently linked with mature faith in both high school and college than any other form of church participation. Isn't that interesting? Their involvement in all church worship, and that doesn't always mean they have to be speaking or up front, but their involvement, right? So are kids at Wayne Pres involved that way? Do they just attend, or is there a place where it's like they feel like the service represents something that speaks to teenagers? Good thing to kind of think about. They've never really found a silver bullet for what the key is, but they said the closest our research has come to a silver bullet is this finding: high school and college students who experience more intergenerational worship tend to have higher faith maturity. So isn't that very interesting, though? It's like that, the intergenerational worship. The next thing they mentioned is the more teenagers serve and build relationships with younger children, more likely it is that their faith will stick. So, we know that, and I'm sure there's lots of opportunities where high school students in particular get to work with younger students, middle school or elementary school kids in many different levels, probably for the church. But that's also very important, but not quite as key as involvement in intergenerational worship. Now, the big Presbyterian church I worked at, we always had this issue of kids would see the youth group as their own church. Even adults did this too, right? Like we had adult groups of hundreds of people in a Sunday school class that saw that as their church. And so sometimes people would avoid the main worship because they had their own little subgroup that was excellent. And so one of the things that we always fought in our big community was kids who would kind of like, they don't really want to go to church because what's in it for them? So they would sometimes go, but they weren't really involved in it. Again, hard in a big congregation. But sticky finding research says critical, very, very important, the most important thing. Here's a couple other things they found that I think are interesting. High school seniors don't feel supported by adults in their congregations. And I know we brainstormed about this a little bit a week ago, but it's like, well, how do you support kids, but there's ways to do that. And there's ways that are uncomfortable probably, or seem a little bit odd or creepy. So we have to be careful, but students feel this way. As a research team, they said we weren't all that surprised that of 5 major sources of support: adults in the congregation, parents, youth workers, friends, and friends outside of youth group, high school seniors ranked the adults in the congregation last. What did surprise us was how far behind the other 4 groups the congregational adults were. One youth group graduate reported that his church would like to talk about having students involved, but they never really did. Another reflected that church members wanted nothing to do with us. I think they see us as kind of scary, and that we're the people on the news, who are dealing drugs and getting pregnant and all these things, keeping us separate and treating us like we were a hazard. So they don't feel supported by adults. I'm sure a lot of that's because adults are like, I don't know, how do I support you? And then one other one here: by far the number one way churches made the teens in our survey feel welcomed and valued was when adults in the congregation showed an interest in them. More than any other program or event, what made kids more likely to feel like a significant part of their local church was when adults made the effort to get to know them. So just a couple of responses real quick. What do you think? How and we got an idea? How do you do that at Wayne? How do you support kids in a way that they wouldn't answer a survey like this? They would say, oh, my church supports me. Anybody got an idea? How do you show interest and how do you support? Anybody got a thought about that?
Well, one of the things that Wayne does that I'm always impressed with is in the confirmation process, each of the young people, and correct me if I'm misstating this, but each of them, I don't know if they're assigned or if they choose one of the elders, and they work as mentors with them over that confirmation process.
Yeah, I was actively involved with that. In fact, unfortunately, the woman that died was the mother of the confirmant that I sponsored at Wayne. But that was, I think, for me, one of the real opportunities for this cross-generational thing, and also to listen and be open. On the other side, in terms of involvement in worship or structuring worship or having anything to do with what happens inside the sanctuary, I'm not sure. I'm allowed to vote on that, but I don't know how we do that for kids.
Yeah, that confirmation idea, that's a good one. All I've seen on that in the past has been where someone like sponsors, like the Episcopal Church does it, where you have to have a sponsor on the morning you join the congregation, and the person walks in with you. But I don't think there's anything beyond that. But it sounds like what you were saying there, Chuck, is that you actually had conversations.
Yeah, we met with them regularly. There was a series of things that happened as part of the overall process as well. They were in a group setting with table leaders, and that was a chance for interaction with a broader group beside the one-on-one as well.
Chuck, I'm also wondering, each of the confirmands writes their own statement of faith and presents it to the session. Is that something that is, that the elder or, the adult also
Yes.
mentors the young person in?
Yeah. You're not going to tell me you read Sawyer's Confirmation of Faith and want to question his elder, do you? Yeah, no, that was definitely part of it. I'm not sure with COVID whether we've restarted that whole confirmation process. I think we did last year, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah, there was at the last session meeting, there was a request. Apparently the structure of, and I think I did this last time I was on session, so that was like 12, 13 years ago. I went through the same process that Chuck did with the kids, and I found that really gratifying. Session is back doing that again, and it's requested that an elder volunteer to walk alongside a single team, a single confirmand, review the statement of faith, have meetings, talk about stuff, get to know them, and then then you get to know somebody. And I think it's a great program.
Yeah, and I would think that that's a tough one at the beginning, right? Because you tell a kid in confirmation, you're going to meet with this older gentleman of the church, and a kid might be like, I don't know about that. And then when you actually have a meeting, what happens, of course, is they discover often, oh, it's kind of a cool guy. Like he's had some neat things in his life, and that's, all of us have I'm always amazed at the stories in this group, the things I hear about, what people have done. And kids aren't aware of those things, but you get a one-on-one like that, and some of that starts to become really interesting. You're like, wow, pretty great stuff. So that's pretty good. Of course, that doesn't affect every kid every way, but that's probably a couple dozen kids a year at least, right? Or maybe in confirmation. And that's good.
One aspect of the confirmation process, when Sarah was here, she had people who felt good about doing it write a statement of faith, the adults, and she would hand out these statements of faith to the confirmands so they could see what such a thing might look like. But it's also written by people who are in their church, maybe even some of the mentors. So they learn about you, not necessarily what you talk to them about, but what you've written in a statement of faith.
And the other thing I remember that we did with high school seniors specifically was more of a recognition of them and sort of letting them know as they were starting their adult lives in whatever form, college or work or whatever, how, you know, the church family was always there for them. And you know, that was, they actually would typically get up in that scenario too. Again, I'm not sure if we're still doing it. My youngest is 23, so it was only 5 years ago that she went through it. But you know, that was again a chance to sort of engage with the high school seniors specifically and try to have them be engaged and connected to the church as they started their lives.
We were very fortunate years ago to have a 80-year young gentleman by the name of Leonard Eister, who would come alongside and do exactly some of these things. And I was blown away that he said, Farwell, you're from Chicago? Yeah. He said, do you know you have a connection with a Moody church? And just blew my mind away. I thought all the family were heathens, but Leonard did these things, and he also invited us to join him for prayer at 5 o'clock in the morning to drive down to Balakinwood. Half an hour drive from me, but the one time that he was late was the last time that I met with him, and then he died shortly thereafter. But he was everything that everyone is talking about right now. And for an 80-year-old man to do that, that is precious, because he had no agenda.
No agenda. It's interesting because most teenagers are used to adults always have agendas. So a no agenda is a pretty interesting thing. It's like, you know, when you talk with someone, you realize, I think they just want to talk to me. Pretty powerful stuff, right? It's pretty good.
So at age 12 and 13, I was just checking on this guy. At age 12 and 13, Archbishop James Usher, before 1600, entered college. And Archbishop Usher is already sleeping with his books at age 12 and 13. He didn't have the distractions of media and various other things probably that would have in Dublin to distract him. However, Jesus is also talking with the teachers of the law there at age 12 and 13. So I'm with, you know, I don't know what the capabilities are of young children. You know, I've got 40 books or 50 books from my teachers. You know, I could show it to you guys, you know, 70, 80-year-old, 60-year-old guys. That's one thing. But what can kids actually do? What can they do? If they get motivated, what can a young child do?
So great, a great thing to just keep pondering about what does involvement in worship mean at Wayne Pres for you guys, right? What does that mean for teenagers? Not just to go or to be there, or that the church has great programs, because certainly Wayne has great programs and staffing for youth. But in terms of intergenerational worship, how does worship at Wayne reflect a kid going there and connecting with what's happening in the room, the music, the illustration, something that says, oh, this relates to my world as well as the adults in this place, right? So good thing to be thinking about. So anyway, and by the way, I thought it was interesting. In week one, I was talking about this great old book called 5 Cries of Youth from the 70s from Merton Strawman in Minnesota. You know, as I mentioned, probably the first youth ministry book I had from a class in seminary. And I thought it was so interesting because this came out in 74. And here's one of their conclusions, even though, you know, they had such different ideas about what teenagers were going through and what were the cries of the issues of kids of the day. When they were looking at like a mature faith, they said this: our analysis shows that the most powerful predictor of youth who see faith as very important is participation in the life of a congregation. In 50 years, the same statement in the Fuller people's books, right? So participation in the life of a congregation. What's participation look like? That's the key. What do you do at Wayne about that? But it's very important. All right, so to kind of wrap things up today as we go in, I want to say a couple things about the 3 questions. And let's start with a scripture so we haven't avoided seeing what the Bible might say about some of this. 1 Thessalonians 2. Always a wonderful passage about setting sort of a goal and a high bar of what ministry is about. Here's what Paul says to the Thessalonians, people who he loved, by the way, right? Because they were doing things pretty well and they had a great reputation and he was proud of them in a lot of ways. In chapter 2 of 1 Thessalonians, verse 6, he says this: "We were not looking for praise from people, not from you or anyone else, even though as apostles of Christ, we could have asserted our authority. Instead, we were like young children among you. Just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you because we loved you so much. We were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. Surely you remember, brothers and sisters, our toil and hardship. We worked night and day in order not to be a burden to anyone while we preached the gospel of God to you. You are witnesses, and so is God, of how holy, righteous, and blameless we were among you who believed. For you know that we dealt with each of you as a father deals with his own children, encouraging, comforting, and urging you to live lives worthy of God, who calls you into his kingdom and glory." What a wonderful image, right? Because Paul says, even though we have the authority, we're apostles, we could assert our authority. We came to you as a mother nursing a child. We came to you as a father concerned about his children. We came comforting, encouraging, urging in a parental way to basically love you into the kingdom. So what a nice model for us, right? That we don't, that our issue, why are kids in the Fuller studies so negative about adults carrying the congregation? Probably because they feel that authority thing first, right? Adults have authority and adults are concerned about doing things right, and and kids sense that often. But our role, according to Paul, is to have a parental role, right? So just like Paul did with the Thessalonians, we have that same role with the children and teenagers in our congregations, right? To say, we are here as parents. We are co-parenting. We're helping and encouraging. So we care about you, and not trying to be a father or mother who's just a disciplinarian, but parents who are concerned about the welfare of their kids, right? And trying to do what's best for them. One other verse that I thought was wonderful on this one was from 2 Corinthians, just a few verses after what we read last week. We were in chapter 5, but if you go to chapter 6, in verse 11, Paul says this: "We have spoken freely to you, Corinthians, and opened wide our hearts to you. We are not withholding our affection from you, but you are withholding yours from us. As a fair exchange, I speak as to my children. Open wide your hearts also." So, Paul, with even the Corinthians, he said, I'm a parent, right? So I'm speaking to you as a parent to a child. We've opened ourselves up to you. So this is something teenagers don't experience with adults in church very often, is hearing the idea of that these older adults in the church are real people, right? How do they figure that one out? I thought this idea about confirmands having a mentor, that's excellent, because what happens in that time is the kids discover that mentor was more than someone who just tells them what you're supposed to do to be a Christian or a member of be a good Presbyterian, but also says, here's what life is like. And it's not always ideal, right? The story of faith is problematic often, right? None of us have perfect stories. We have lots of things we've muddled through, and we sometimes have a hard time telling others about those things we've struggled with. But I think teenagers want that openness. They want to know, oh, the adults it's not all perfect. There are faith issues that people struggle with who've been around in the faith a long time. They just want to know that there's people who care. And I think we do that by being open, like Paul was trying to be with the Thessalonians and Corinthians. Open up our hearts. How do we open books? One of the things that they said early on in the 3 Questions book was talking about how a common thing with youth pastors is actually certain youth groups is to have adults come and share faith stories. You remember how when especially when we were younger, testimonies. I don't know how it was in churches you grew up with, if you had a church you grew up in. We were big with testimonies in my church. People having time on Sunday night service to get up and tell what God had done, and it was great. Lots of stories that way. Then when I was doing ministry in the 80s, young youth minister, we did more. It was more about doing program well. And and really just doing excellent planning and program, and less about stories. I found today, like if I go speak at a retreat, which I still do occasionally with teenagers, it's becoming less and less every year as I age out of relevance on some of those things. But I will be amazed at something that they brought back into retreats these days, that I see at virtually every retreat, is a testimony from somebody. And I've been at retreats where I was the speaker, and they had some adult, young adult give a testimony who talked for 15, 20 minutes. And then they said, then the speaker comes up, and I'm thinking, you don't need a speaker. You just had a speaker, and better than the speaker, because you got a story from someone who gave you a real picture of how hard life can be, but how God works through your real difficult challenges. Right. So, but I think that's a good one. I think it might be something. I mean, that's obviously up to Austin, whether he does that kind of thing, but it's not a bad suggestion to say, is there ever a time when you need someone to come share a story about how hard the Christian life can be sometimes, or how did I work through a difficult time in my life, or, whatever it might be. But sharing faith stories is a great opportunity for older men in a church to be able to say, how do I care for the kids of my church, like Paul caring for these churches as a mother and a father, by sharing my story, sharing who I am a little bit. And we all know that those questions of life are often difficult, things that we've lived, are hard. I talk about my own church growing up sometimes, the Emmanuel Baptist in Denver. In a lot of ways, it's a great church. A lot of it had like problems like every other church. One of the great things on involvement is they let us get involved. They let us play instruments like guitars and do our music in church. I'm always been amazed that my church allowed us to do that. They had no idea that we were often singing songs from Godspell, which was considered heresy in the 70s. But we were doing these great Godspell songs, and our church let us do those things. So involvement was good. In terms of stories, though, I don't remember people in my church, adults, talking much about the struggle of the Christian life with us to understand, but hearing more about success of the Christian life. But the reality is, we all know it's a struggle. And when you're a teenager, when you go from the cognitive ability to accept whatever your parents say, and then realize, I'm wondering if God really exists, but who can I say that to? Can I bring that up at Wayne Pres to say, I don't think God's listening to this, without being someone jumping all over them? I mean, kids want to be able to express what they're struggling with. And they want to hear that from adults, to know that's a reality. That's part of what the Christian faith is about. I don't know if you guys know who John Westerhoff is. Have you ever heard that name? John Westerhoff was a Christian ed professor, I think at Duke. And I think he worked with the Methodist Church most of his life. And he wrote a book back in the 60s, or maybe a little bit later than that, maybe 70s and 80s, where he did a lot of work on the idea of his main book was, will our children have faith? And I think I can share, Frank, I think I can share something, right? Briefly. I could probably do this. So
Yes.
Westerhoff he had this, I always like these simple things, right? Because I'm a simple guy. So I like when people have formulations of simple ways to grab ideas that aren't too complex that can be remembered. Westerhoff had this thing called Styles of Faith, often called the Circles of Faith. And he said, this is how kids embrace the faith generally, if they're brought up in a church, right? Obviously, it doesn't, it's not looking at evangelism of those who become Christians later. But he said, what happens when in that red circle, experience faith, that's when you're a little kid and you go along with your parents and you are, you just, you learn, like, we're coming up in a couple of months, we'll have Christmas services, and a lot of churches, maybe Wayne does this, a candlelight service. Do you do candlelight Christmas service, Christmas Eve? Little kids, they grow up knowing, oh, it's candlelight service. They get very excited about that, right? Because that's experienced faith. This is what we we're brought and we're part of it. And then affiliative is where we offer kids a chance to become a part, right? So this is when you talk about confirmation, right? This doesn't always work out in confirmation, by the way, right? Because confirmation, sadly, is often the last thing kids do in church, right? They join the church to satisfy their parents and then they're gone. But the goal of confirmation, just like regular church membership and other denominations, is the idea of affiliative faith, that I am choosing to be a part of this group, right? So that's great. Well, in Westerhoff circles, he's got the questioning or searching circle. And he said, and he was a big proponent that you have to deal with doubts. You have to deal with doubts with kids rather than avoid their questions. Now, I don't know about you. I've often avoided teenagers' questions because sometimes their questions are too deep for me. Sandy, you mentioned like, what can a 10-year-old do? We've all had 10-year-olds who said something to us that were like, what? How did you come up with that question, right? And so I know with teenagers, not unusual for me to have teenagers who so much smarter than their youth leader, and they would ask questions that was tempting to either joke them aside for me or to say, well, let's look at that next week. Right. But approaching the questioning and searching questions, just thinking how the author who wrote some of these big it just popped into my head about this one. Sorry, I didn't have it in my notes, but the what's the guy's name, the author who did the books about all the symbolic things in Christian history, that was all these novels that took a lot of freedom with historical
The Dan Brown novels?
The Dan Brown novels. Yes, yeah, right. So, they're actually really interesting novels, aren't they? If you've read them, they're really engaging, but they're biblically kind of ridiculous. And I saw an interview with Dan Brown once, and he said, well, it all started because someone asked him in the interview, well, why are you so interested in religious things and all this symbolism? He said, well, I grew up in a church, and but when I got to a point when I was about 12, and at school they were talking about the Big Bang Theory, and my church was not. And I asked, well, what do you do with that? And I was told, just believe and don't worry about it. Like, just trust. And he said it wasn't good enough for me. And so he kept those questions going and became, a writing career, but not a writing career that embraced the faith, but more questioned the faith. And I just thought, I don't know how many times I probably did that. A 12-year-old asking me a question that I couldn't deal with. Instead of saying, wow, let's figure this out, let's study this. I kind of avoided it. But Westerhoff said, if you don't go through questioning and searching faith, he said, I don't believe that the purple circle owned can even happen. But a lot of what happens in a lot of what parents like is when kids go from affiliative to owned, and they don't want to deal with doubts, right? Because parents, I don't know about you, but when your kid starts doubting, there's nothing more frustrating than maybe your kid saying something to you that you're like, all I poured into you all your life, and you have doubts about this whole faith. What are you doing? Right? But we have to embrace that, right? As adults, and in the Christian community at Wayne, when kids have doubts and questions, they have got to feel that it's okay to raise those questions without being judged or attacked, but to be listened to and to say, tell me what you're thinking about that, right? Because they got all these doubts, and sometimes those doubts are really brilliant. Sometimes kids' doubts are, we might want to say, well, that's kind of silly, but we have to embrace and listen, right? Well, that's what we got to do. So I've always liked Westerhoff's styles of faith, just to say a really critical part of faith development is to go through doubts and questioning. And for a lot of kids, that doesn't happen until they go to college, because they couldn't raise those questions in their own faith community at home in high school. But what a wonderful thing. This is part of why it's one of the things I've always liked about Presbyterians. Presbyterians like education. So in the Presbyterian circles, everybody likes being educated, and no one is generally not afraid to talk about deeper things or reasons or, struggles or, what about God's existence? What about this form of what the church does? Blah, blah, blah. Why does evil exist? All these things. By the way, teenagers are funny because when they come up with a doubt, they feel like they're the first human on the planet who's ever thought about it. Right. And I remember that. But do you guys remember this? I remember when I was about 12 or 13 and I was reading something in church about the Bible, and I realized, wow, the number 7 is like really important. And I thought, I didn't know. I thought I discovered something that no one had probably ever discovered about the Bible. The number 7, and then later the number 666 was even scarier on the whole thing. Right. So, in fact, I was, on family vacation once, looking out the window of the car driving, and we were in Arizona, and I saw a sign that said we were on Route 666, the offshoot of Route 66. And I thought, I instantly knew I'm the Antichrist. Now, did I ever ask anybody about that? No, I never said to anybody, like I didn't say to my youth pastor, am I the Antichrist? Because I was on Highway 666 and I saw it out of the window. Well, someone would probably laugh at me back then and say, no, you're not the Antichrist. But if I had actually asked that question, which I was scared to do because I really wondered if I really was, if some adult had said to me, well, let's talk about, is that reasonable? That you might be that. Let's talk about that. Have other people ever seen that sign? Maybe I wasn't I think I realized I was not the Antichrist, thank goodness, eventually. But the thing is, I remember having some of these little questions. I wasn't sure who would answer. Who at Wayne Pres can help kids answer doubts and questions where adults wouldn't get all over them, but would help them think through, maybe there are some ways to think about this, some solutions about how a Christian thinks about these things. My own 3 daughters, very just like your own kids, very different. My youngest was the academic in our family. She was the one who understood science better than her dad ever could. And I remember thinking that it was my daughter, even in junior high and middle school, where she knew that Christians joking about evolution was a silly joke. And we were at some events where sometimes speakers would make it sound like evolution is the dumbest thing you could ever imagine. It's completely illogical. And I thought, that works for a lot of us to think that's just kind of a dumb idea. But I looked at my daughter and I thought, this is my daughter who is going to understand how the evolutionary process works. And she's not going to buy a faith response that says, oh, it's just not real. Throw it out. She's going to want to talk about it with thoughtful people, right? Now I know in a congregation like Wayne, there are kids struggling with science and faith issues in school and with other Christians and kids. And there's some pretty thoughtful people at Wayne Pres. A lot of you guys are part of that, who know a lot about science and a lot about faith and trying to integrate or, how to deal with some of those conflicts. Those are conversations that are not easy solutions, but they're great things to talk about. And I think there are teenagers who really want to have conversations with adults who've wrestled through some of those things to go, oh, maybe there's a light at the end of the tunnel on some of these things, but it's not just a simple expression of, don't doubt, don't worry about it. My wife grew up in Assembly of God church, and she said her mom used to sing a song sometimes that would just go, believe it because it is true. That was the song. Just believe it because it is true. It's like, that doesn't work for teenagers very well. Teenagers want more than just say, oh, just trust us and believe it. They want to work through the doubts. Who better than adult men to find some way who wrestled with these things for decades without always having answers, but to know, no, there are reasons why we still walk by faith, even though we don't have all the answers.
Teenagers, getting them to actually ask sincere questions. How do you cross the barrier of where they just assume you don't understand? My life is too different. Your life was, back in the gray days. You just don't understand. So I'm not going to bother to try to explain it to you.
I think it's helpful if the adult is open to share that they don't have all the answers. For example, when I've talked to parents about like how to talk with your kids about issues about sex and dating and things, I've rarely found parents who ever want to be honest with their kids about their own struggles when they were high school students or college students and trying to figure out those issues in their life. Because they're like, well, I can't talk about those things with my kids. But the kids want to talk about it. So I think that maybe part of what you do is to be honest and open to take the lead on that one. I'm not saying you have to start out with talking about kids, go like, so you got any issues about sexual pressure that you want to, here's what I dealt with when I was a kid. But I think when you talk about let me go back to issues about creation, evolution. I think if a kid hears from an adult to say, here's what doesn't work for me with the church response right now. Here's where I'm struggling with this. That doesn't make sense to me. I think it opens up the conversation for the kid to know, oh, they don't have all the answers. They've got problems and questions themselves. They have doubts. I think there's a connection and there's a way to relate to that for a kid. Does that make sense, Scott? I think you almost kind of take the lead to say, you might not have things you want to talk about with me about. Let me ask you, what do you think about this? Here's something I struggle with as an adult. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but like some of the stuff going on politically still drives me nuts these days, right? So would I be honest with a teenager to say, wow, I'm as puzzled when I was your age, it was the Nixon. I mean, I'm as puzzled now about politics as when I was your age, because I don't know what the answers are, right? So there are good and bad answers on both sides of the political debates, right? So I think to be open about that, Scott, to say, I don't know what your issues are, but let me tell you what mine are that I'm struggling with. Maybe that opens up the conversation a little bit to say, I also have some things I can't put together.
Albert Einstein in his 60s, and this is on radio. So it was broadcast pretty much to the world about Albert Einstein. He basically said, and I'm not sure when in the 1940s it was, but he said, if there's a personal God, I'm in deep trouble, is what he basically said. If there is a personal God, I am in deep trouble. And I don't know what happened in this ensuing 10 years, whatever. I don't know, after the bomb and all the other stuff. But my question, well, I'm hoping I get a chance to talk to Albert Einstein actually up there in heaven. And my question to Albert Einstein, for all of his, Isaac Newton and all the guys that are your scientists, is, Albert, did you ever think that the first guys lived 900 years, Adam through Noah, in essence, were 900-year living guys, and now you see these 900-year-old living guys. Now, it's not your field, relativity and physics and all that. However, what do you think now in terms of your reason? You kind of botched it. I mean, you botched it through your 60s. You didn't get it, did you? And, what am I doing kind of upbraiding Albert Einstein? And, again, but you can tell the kids that. I mean, the kid, they don't have all the answers.
Yeah.
The men don't have all the answers. Right.
No. And I remember a few years ago, the Templeton Foundation Award for Science and Faith went to a Princeton professor who actually has Einstein's old office. And he got that award, which is a pretty substantial award, right, from John Templeton Foundation, right? So he got that award because of his work on faith and science issues. And I always thought it was interesting. The guy who was sitting in Einstein's current office and was a Presbyterian, by the way, went to a Presbyterian church in Princeton, somehow was still a guy of faith. Like, I find that very fascinating. It's like, I don't remember what the guy's name was, who it was. He's probably retired by now, but very, very interesting. I think there are really smart people out there. And Sandy, you're probably right. I mean, who knows where Einstein, I would assume Einstein is going to be, we're going to meet Einstein, because I don't know if he was so much in trouble, but he did conceive that there was, he did have allowance for God, right? In his thinking that there was a God, just not a personal God, right? Wasn't that kind of the Einstein thing? So, but anyway, not to digress too much in that one. I mean, I got to wrap up so we can pray and make sure we can chat a little more if we want to. At the end of the Belongings book, Fuller youth people say this. Here's the key thing. Pay attention. Pay attention to kids. Not just through listening, but be a student. To be a student of teenagers. See, that to be a student of teenagers, not just to listen to an individual kid, but is to look at their world and say, how do I be a student of what their environment is about? So, over the years I was at Eastern, I taught adolescent culture for 23 years every spring. And I always find it so interesting because the culture that affects adolescents changed every year. The music changed, movies changed, all kinds of things. Influences on teenagers are always changing. When I was a young youth leader, we had to deal with, Rubik's Cube problems, to Game Boys, to cell phones eventually, to right, like it's always changing. A year ago, one of my TAs said, we got to talk about TikTok for a couple weeks probably, because TikTok is everything right now. I'm like, everything? She says, it's everything. And I'm thinking, why is it everything? Good question for you guys to do on your own a little bit. What's the big deal about TikTok? Why is this such a big deal right now? Why are teenagers so into TikTok? Because I'm thinking, like, what's TikTok? It's just a bunch of little short videos that you could do on anything else. It's like, no, it's different. So to be a student of the teenagers in your community is to try and do a little bit of a study of what is it about their environment, what are they concerned with? This is where we would discover things like the percentage of kids who are worried about being safe at school. Last night's shooting or yesterday, whenever it was, a day or so ago at Roxborough, was another example of, why kids are concerned about being safe. I don't think I worried about my safety when I was in school ever. But that's a big thing today. So pay attention is what the Fuller youth people say to do with these questions that kids have. Pay attention, listen to them, and be a student of what their lives are about and what their environment is. Let's pray for a moment, and then we'll keep chatting if you want. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for, again, some wisdom from people studying teenagers. Thank you, Lord, for these guys and all their concern and interest in not just the kids of their church, but their own families and grandkids. Help us that we all find ways to make connections with kids in our families and at church, that we're not just authority figures. We're not just people who supposedly have answers to everything, or we judge everything, but we are fathers and mothers of the kids near us, that we are parents who are comforting and encouraging. Help us to pay attention. In Jesus' name, amen.